Welcome to our 20th SLiTHER, our first one for the summer of 2021. We are fast approaching the 1-year anniversary of the Ionic Viper hosted SLiTHERs, something we're looking forward to. We've got these scheduled about every 2 weeks, so please stay tuned to whatever outlet you found about this one from, be it Twitter, Facebook, Discord, the Ionic Viper website, or whatever else. But with that, I am very pleased and happy to announce today's speaker, Dr. Sabrina Collins, from Lawrence Tech University. Sabrina has been a great friend of the community over the years, provided us with lots of great stuff, and she's done it again. She's just helped put together and edited ACS Symposium series book on African American chemists, and she's going to tell us about the experience and give us some insights into it, and I really look forward to it. So Sabrina, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Chip, and welcome everybody, and always happy to be with my Viper buddies once again. So let me share my screen. Basically, I just want to have a brief conversation about storytelling in the classroom, and the experience of serving as editor for the first time of an ACS Symposium book. So this is an image of the Marburger STEM Center where I serve as executive director. And one of the reasons why I love this, showing this, is because it kind of reminds me of a lobe of a d orbital. That's really a staircase. And so that's what I see when I actually look at it. I don't know which d orbital, but one of them, one of the five. So just very quickly, so I'm going to share, why this book, why now? Tell you a little bit about some contributing book authors, developing a learning object. One of the first learning objects that you actually see in the book as part of an appendix, and some lessons learned. And so about a year ago, I received an email from an editor from ACS, basically wanting to chat about a potential project for a new ACS Symposium book celebrating chemists of color, in this case, African-American chemists. And so, as you can imagine, at this time a year ago, what was going on in the country, right? So you had a lot of protests taking place all over the country. People were protesting in the city of Detroit, where I live. COVID was happening. It hit Michigan really hard, the city of Detroit. It was just a lot going on. And at the time, I really wasn't sure if I had the bandwidth to take on this kind of responsibility. But I did chat with the editor. Her name was Amanda. And I decided to take on the project. And so what I wanted to make, as editor, I wanted to be responsible and respectful, of a project like this, and the contributing authors. And I wanted it to be more than just some sort of a history book, not just providing, okay, they graduated from here, they worked here. Tell a story, that could be really interesting. So what we have really are stories really for broadening the image of a chemist in the classroom. And so at the end of each chapter are lesson plans, but they're really learning objects, which, I take from my wonderful Viper colleagues. And so I'm going to share one particular learning object that I developed for inorganic chemistry. Now, the image on the cover was actually designed by a recent LTU grad in architecture and design. And so he was really into Spider-Man and Black Panther. So he came up with this particular image, which I absolutely love. So I love being able to collaborate across disciplines. And actually, it reminds me of a sky bridge connected to the state-of-the-art facility that makes vibranium for the world, or whatever, so that's what I think when I look at it. And so the co-authors for the contributing authors for this book were selected because I kind of have personal connections with many of them. And for example, the late Dr. Richard Evans, I remember I first met him 21 years ago when I was a postdoc at Louisiana State. Dr. Evans is actually the first African-American earned a PhD in chemistry from Louisiana State, 1971. And I was floored when he told me that he was a student of St. Elmo Brady's. So as much, you know, and Professor Brady is a hero of mine. So to hear someone that actually took classes, was mentored by him, was fascinating. And so I'm delighted that we were able to share his essay. Another example is Dr. Angela Peters. She was my first department chair when I taught at Claflin University. Professor Abebe, who teaches here at Lawrence Tech, she is the co-author of that first Vibranium paper that we actually did. So I have connections with a lot of folks. And one of the other things that really stands out is really the importance of HBCUs. Many of these folks earn their undergraduate degrees from HBCUs, or they're teaching at HBCUs. And I also have some high impact articles published in journal articles, published in high impact journals. And so the very first learning object in the book that's in the introduction is based on a recent paper that I published in the Chemical Educator last year. So this is a collaboration with two of my former students from the College of Worcester, and I'm so proud of both of them. And at the time, this particular paper focuses on 5 different transition metal complexes shown at the bottom and evaluating them against lung cancer cell lines. And so we were able to grow some X-ray quality crystals, which is always fun. And so I thought about, okay, if I were still teaching inorganic chemistry, because I haven't taught it in 6 years, you know, and I wanted to bring this into the classroom, how would I do it? And immediately I put on my Ionic Viper hat and started thinking about how I would bring this into the classroom. And the first thing I thought about was one of my favorite learning objects, which Adam published back in 2013, you know, generating these ligand group orbitals and help, you know, constructing these MO diagrams. And I think this is one of my favorites because I did graduate work with Bruce Burston, right? And so that's a lot of stuff that he did. And as I recall, I think you have to use projection operators to generate symmetry adapted linear combinations. You know, I think that's what you have to do. I don't want to do that anymore. But I think this is one of the reasons why it was my favorite. And so, and obviously Adam had published this particular article in 2013. And so I basically took some ideas from Adam to develop one of these learning objects. And so what I did here is I took one of the molecules, one of the copper complexes, and so imagine that this is C2V, point group of C2V for this particular molecule. And you have those following orbitals as the generator functions. Well, doing that, you should end up with some LGOs that look like the following. Now, what Adam suggested is that there's another way to do this. If you have this in the XY plane and assume that D4H symmetry and that each one of the ligands are equivalent, you could use the S, the PX, the PY, and the DX squared minus Y squared, and also do the same thing. So this was fun. I had to go back and review a whole lot of stuff that I hadn't taught, but I wanted to bring in, the Viper training and experiences that I had as part of the book. And so also in the introduction, I mentioned one of my learning objects, which focuses on Professor Greg Robinson, who was who's still an inspiration to me, and some of that amazing chemistry that played out in Chemical and Engineering U so many years ago when I was a graduate student. It was just a real fascinating and fun time to be an inorganic chemist. And so I mentioned this because this is an example of how you can bring storytelling into the classroom. Now, the very first chemist that's profiled in the book, so I actually wrote this chapter, is about Dr. Betty Washington Green. So she was a physical chemist. And what I was really excited about is I had the opportunity to interview her daughter, because I wanted to go beyond, okay, she earned his PhD and she worked at Dow. What else did I learn about her? So she was a native of Palestine, Texas, earned her undergraduate degree from Tuskegee Institute, and then came to Wayne State in 1960 and earned her PhD in 1965. And so what's interesting about that, at the time that she earned her PhD in 1965, she was one of only a handful of, it was a small number of African-American women that had earned PhDs before her. So she might have been number 5 or 6, I think, from that time period. But what was also interesting is that Wayne State during that time period was a leading producer of African-Americans earning PhDs in chemistry. So you had Wayne State, University of Chicago, and Ohio State. They were the top 3 up until the late 1960s. I don't know what the numbers are at this point, but that's what was going on at the time. And so her daughter shared with me how she loved Aretha Franklin and all of these, wonderful things about her, that she loved to garden, plant roses and those kinds of things. And I thought that was really important to share. But once she earned her PhD from Wayne State, she accepted a position at Dow Chemical in Midland, Michigan. And in 1970, she was promoted to senior research chemist. Now, what her daughter shared with me is that she did experience some challenges on the job because some chemists that she was training were getting promoted, ahead of her. They had less training. And so she was rather frustrated about some of those experiences. But nevertheless, she did have a successful career. She has several peer-reviewed publications and patents. But what I think is really most fascinating about her is that her daughter earned her PhD in physics in 1988 from the University of Chicago. And I find that fascinating because I really don't know how many mothers and daughters actually earn PhDs in a STEM discipline. I don't think that's very common, but her mother was a role model for her. Her daughter is also a songwriter and has won a Grammy Award, so just all kinds of really amazing tidbits about her. And she's currently on the faculty at Loyola University at the Department of Physics. The second, one of the other chemists, Dr. Darryl Boyd, who is really, I would say, like my brother from another mother. He is really into Marvel Studios, Black Panther, all of that stuff. So he really does some really, really cool stuff. But he's a native of Kalamazoo, Michigan, earned his undergraduate degree from University of Michigan, then went on to Purdue University and earned his PhD in inorganic chemistry in 2010. And so following that, he actually was a postdoc with the United States Naval Research Laboratory, and eventually he transitioned to a full-time research chemist in the optical sciences division. And his research really focuses on sulfur and selenium-based polymer chemistry. So he's an inorganic chemist, and I think he's really, really fabulous. So he's also part of the class of 2018, the C&E News Talented 12, which is always, I think, a wonderful recognition. And he has a lot of papers, inorganic chemistry, ACS macro letters, you name it. He's first author, on a number of these publications. But what's really, I think, fascinating is how he and his wife, Sarah, established this company, Science Made Simple, for community engagement. So that's that entrepreneurship, piece. You have these backgrounds in STEM. What else can you do really to impact the community? Another chemist who I obviously want to celebrate is Professor Angela Peters, who was my department chair at Claflin University when I was a young assistant professor in South Carolina. So she earned her undergraduate degree from Hampton University. And what I learned about her, what I didn't know, is that after she earned her undergraduate degree, she worked as a lab technician for Sun Oil a sun oil refinery for about 4 years. And then she returned to school because she realized in order for her to advance on the job or get an increase in salary, she needed an advanced degree. So she returned to Hampton, which is the HBCU, earned her master's, and eventually earned her PhD in biochemistry from University of South Carolina. And so she's had a number of career highlights, including serving as executive director of South Carolina's version of LSAMP as well, then professor and chair at Claflin University. She's had a number of different awards. She's currently provost at Albany State University, which is another HBCU in Georgia. But I share this because she's an example of, having these careers at HBCU, starting off as a student and working her way up, right, all the way to senior leadership. And I just think that's really fascinating. And she's an important mentor for me personally. And the last scientist that I kind of want to highlight is Mr. Dag Abebe. And basically, he's a filmmaker and he's a physicist. And so the reason why I'm really fascinated about this is because I think it's important that young people realize that you can get these degrees in a STEM discipline and you can use it to impact the world and the communities. And so he actually immigrated from Ethiopia when he was about 10 years old, grew up in Virginia, and earned his BS degree in physics with a minor in film studies from University of Virginia. And in 2019, he graduated from the USC Film and TV Production MFA program. But while he was a student at USC, he received a grant from the Sloan Foundation. So he was able to use that to produce this narrative film, The Ball Method, about Alice Augusta Ball. It's a 19-minute film. I had a chance to watch it. It's on Amazon Prime. And it's really fascinating. And so telling the story of Alice Augusta Ball, who was a graduate of University of Washington, University of Hawaii, co-authored a Jack's paper in 1914, which just blows me away, and developed the first viable treatment for leprosy, which was a serious public health crisis during that time period. There was a race to try to figure out a viable cure or treatment. And so he tells a story. So in his chapter, basically, he's describing how you can use this film as a case study for chemistry majors. But also in his learning object or lesson plan, he basically describes an activity where students can create their own narrative films using their cell phones, a 5-minute narrative film on some sort of chemistry concept or a historical figure. And that gives students a chance to be creative and innovative and really get them to play the roles of writers, producers, and that sort of directors of these films. But it also gives them a chance to really apply the knowledge that they're learning in the classroom and really thinking about the concepts more deeply. And so he also co-founded a film association where he's able to create more films like this, to engage the community. And I just think that's really fascinating. So basically some, lessons learned, some reflections. For me, I had a chance, obviously, as editor to read everybody's chapter, and I was looking for some connecting themes or ideas, right, that connects all of the chemists. And obviously, what came through was effective mentoring being an important component for all of us, because effective mentoring is needed in order to establish a science identity or chemistry identity, right? And then you go from developing these skill sets and chemistry identity and skill sets, helping to establish that technical credibility. All of that is connected, in some sort of way. But for me, really, the central question about this book, it really focuses on one question: who does chemistry and why? That's the question that I've always been trying to answer, even in the classroom. I've always tried to connect history and chemistry because I just love both of the disciplines so much. So what are some strategies or ideas that you can use going forward? I think, seminar invitations, obviously, is I think a good approach for the classroom. And the only really silver lining of the pandemic is we're connected virtually, so we can you can certainly do that. Literature reading assignments. I mean, there are several obviously in Viper. You can create others using some of the articles, like for example, what Darryl Boyd is doing with sulfur and selenium polymer chemistry. And what's really cool about that, you can have this literature assignment. You can have students be able to ask questions maybe virtually, right, of the authors. And I think students would get a kick out of that. Certainly using learning objects within the that are in the book. But it's all about storytelling in the classroom. Back in January, I had a chance to publish an article in Nature Chemistry where I talk about using storytelling to broaden the image of a chemist in the classroom. Because I actually think chemists, we are storytellers. We just tell stories through the molecules and systems that we investigate. Just like so I always try to incorporate the storytelling in some way. And so I've just been talking maybe for about a few minutes here, but I wanted to open it up for questions. If anybody has any questions on this, on the book, and thank you so much for listening.
Thanks, Sabrina. That was great. Do we have any questions from the floor?
I will say that it was hard being an editor. that was not easy. And part of it, because I've worked as a writer and an editor previously for AAAS, and one of the things that you always want to do is maintain the voice of the writer. You don't want to get to the point where you're editing so much that it's your voice and not their voice. So sitting on my hands a lot, and making sure that their voices are coming through. That was important, to be responsible and really make sure their perspective was coming through. Because I did try to recruit a couple of other people to serve as editor, but I was not successful. And I ended up serving as editor myself.
Joanne.
So Sabrina, you have a kind of a long history of researching and learning about Black chemists and sharing that information with us, and we really appreciate that. So because you've been doing that for a while, I just wonder, what are a couple new things that you learned from doing this book, and new people that you learned about, or new ideas that you hadn't thought about before?
Yeah, for me, what was really interesting is when the reviewer comments would come back, because I would see the reviewer comments, and the authors, and reviewers have some really interesting perspectives on the chapters, and getting me to think a little bit differently, and the authors to think a little bit differently about things. For example, with the chapter that focused on Alice Augusta Ball, one of the reviewers started asking questions. For example, what kinds of techniques and laboratory glassware did these chemists have back during that time period? And I had never really thought about that, and so we ended up including this new section describing, laboratory equipment that was available back then. And so the University of Hawaii, I went back to them because that's what she was working at the time. I said, do you guys have any images of what the labs looked like back then? And so in the book, there's an image of one of the labs, and it looks just like a lab today. It's got a Bunsen burner and all of this stuff. The only difference now is we have access to NMR and mass spec and IR, all these different things. And it just goes to show you, I think, how brilliant the chemists back then were, because they didn't have as many tools as we have, to figure out what they were actually for their characterization techniques. It just, so it made me take a step back and go, that's pretty amazing. Because to not have those tools and be able to make those compounds and characterize them, I just think is absolutely fascinating. So that's one of the key things that I learned from all of this. So I have a really deep appreciation from for scientists from the early 20th century. I just think it's brilliant. I really do.
Yeah, that comes out strongly in the Percy Julian documentary as well, where you're just like, how did he figure this out? It's
right.
just amazing.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Were there any reports of compound tastes in the papers that you saw? That was one of my favorite characterization techniques.
Did not see that, but but you're right. That was one of the. I know that was pretty popular, you know. But yeah, so that was one of the key things, getting me to think about the history, you know, a little bit more, you know, how far we've come as chemists, and those kinds of things. And so it was. I'm really glad that I did this. It was a learning process, you know, for me. I think I learned a lot about myself in terms of editing and those kinds of things.
Go ahead, Taylor.
Yeah, so you mentioned like vibranium in Black Panther, right? And you have that paper in Chem Ed about using that as an example in the classroom. So have you found like a big difference, or do you have a connection to like fiction versus nonfiction as a way of engaging like storytelling in the classroom?
I think that's a great, you know, a great idea. And, you know, for me, I'm glad you asked that question, Taylor, because one of the things that I worry about is, you know, in a lot of these films, the science is just wrong, right? It's just really, really wrong. And is that a good thing? And in some ways, I think it is a good thing because it allows us as chemists to talk about real science and what's what's really what really works and what doesn't. So no, I think that's you raise a good point, and I'm really thinking about the next step in terms of exploring the superhero science and where we can actually take that. So I'm looking forward to Black Panther 2 coming out next year. And maybe I'll be inspired again to write another paper, you know, on the topic.
Other questions? So in interviewing the daughter, how did she feel that you were interested in learning about her mother's story? You know, was it kind of a really welcome surprise? Was she happy to talk to you about her mom's story?
She absolutely was. And we had a couple of cell phone conversations, and it was like talking to an old buddy or something. You know, it was a lot of fun. And what was really fun for me, because, you know, I grew up in Detroit. And so one of the things that her daughter said is, you know what, I was growing up in Detroit when there was a new group called the Supremes coming up, you know, and so she's saying all of this. And it's funny to me because that's kind of what my parents, you know, feel about Motown and that sort of thing. And she really felt as though because she was here, living here during that time with her mother earning her doctorate, that impacted her interest in music, why she ended up as doing songwriting and eventually winning a Grammy and those kinds of things. So that was a lot of fun, you know, talking with her about her experiences growing up in Detroit. And one of the things, the other thing that she said is she was talking about, you know, how Wayne State was this powerhouse, you know, the chemistry department was just internationally recognized, you know, they were doing so much good chemistry, and they still are, you know, it's still an amazing department.
You mentioned that you had to do, or weren't necessarily successful at finding co-editors. How did you find finding authors, chapter authors?
You know, that actually went a lot, you know, for me, because I had to sit down and think about, okay, whose story do I want to tell? I mean, there's so many, you can only tell so many stories in a book. And so I started thinking about people that I knew, you know, who had impacted me over the years. And so that's kind of how the ideas started happening. And actually, Because, for example, I mentioned Dr. Richard Evans. He had passed away in April, I believe, of last year. And so I ended up, it just kind of organically happened that I got a copy of an essay that he had been working on for years about St. Elmo Brady. And so the family, gave us permission, to publish it. And it just, everything just started kind of coming together. And so, I wanted an opportunity really to celebrate other chemists that that are rather unknown, but they've just made such an important impact on me personally.
Of course, Sabrina, you meant it kind of inorganically happened, Remember who
right. You're right. It inorganically happened, not organically happened. I do love organic chemists. I do. But their compounds are only yellow, white, and brown. No fun.
Oh, very nice. I had something. Does anyone else have a question while I remember the one I was going to ask just a minute ago? Or anything they'd like to comment on?
I just really like that you have a span of chemists, like some that are more modern and some more historic. So I think that's really nice.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I wanted to, because there are a number of books out there that focus on the historical figures, but not so much modern, contemporary chemists. And I think that's important, because we're always talking about how it's important that young people see people that look like them. Well, you need to tell their stories, and those need to be incorporated into the class curriculum, as possible. So just like I think it's important to talk about Percy Julius, it's also important to talk about Greg Robinson, and all these other folks that are doing some really amazing work.
Yeah, and it's also great. I love the fact that you brought in the sort of curriculum development or teaching part of it as well. I mean, that, given your position at Lawrence, that's so perfect that you would do that, and so thank you from all the Viper folks for the shout out about that as well. That really means a lot to us.
No, thank you. I mean, when I sat down and thought about, okay, I wanted lesson plans. What do I do? Viper. I've been doing that for so many, and it just started coming, everything started coming back. So I sat down and started, I had to go back and look at Cotton's book on group theory and all of that to try to remember point groups. And I think Bruce would be a little proud that some of that stuff stuck along the way, so yeah. And so for me, it's really about, because I want to let everybody know, Viper is this wonderful, wonderful community. It's got all of these fantastic resources, to use to help really enhance your classroom presence, and so I wanted that to shine through. In fact, with Angela's lesson plan, she actually cites one of the Viper activities using the protein database data bank, which was another one of my favorite learning objects, how you can use that, to enhance your teaching.
I was really interested. So you had mentioned, like after it was written and as you're piecing it together, then you started thinking like, well, what are the themes that I'm seeing here? And kind of mentorship popped up. I thought that was cool. I think when I'm done with the project, I'm ready for it to be done. So it's kind of cool to think like, oh, now I have this thing and I can actually think about what does it mean? So in terms of mentorship, that seems like it would be super important. Were there like specific stories or examples of particularly effective mentors that kind of stuck with you at the end of the book?
Yeah, for me, each one of the chemists, they were talking about either their undergraduate advisor or their PhD advisor and what roles they played, in them sticking with chemistry and pursuing that as a career. And so, and all of us at some point, we had to be mentored and adopt this chemistry identity. But it's like, why? What happened in your life, the reason why you decided, okay, science is for me or chemistry is for me. And so everybody's story was slightly different, but as I was, you know, like you, Taylor, once I'm done with the project, I'm like, okay, enough. But I had to write a final chapter. And so since I had a chance to read everybody's chapter, I was like, okay, what are the connecting ideas here? You know, and so that's what really came through. And actually, the chapter by Dr. Nodi Washington, who had a wonderful career at Procter & Gamble. So she was talking about the importance of establishing technical credibility within your organization, you know, in order for you to be successful. And, you know, how everything that you do has to be grounded in fundamental science and engineering principles. And so she was real, you know, so that was really coming through. And so that's kind of how I, you know, started connecting themes together, connecting chapters together.
David.
Yeah, thank you. I was actually going back to the previous question where you were talking about the learning objects and how you used the Ionic Viper LOs as sort of a framework for structuring this. I've been thinking a lot about, you know, one, humanizing the scientists in chemistry at levels. Taylor knows I'm teaching the inorganic for our class or our at Cal Poly next fall. And I'm also been thinking about a lot about like projects that are not so quantitative, right? Projects where there's more creative input and agency.
Yep.
And I just wanted to say I appreciated you bringing that up because it's given me a bunch of great ideas for what to do for the fall. And things like, here's a paper, part of this paper, find out what you can about the authors. Like, and now we have this resource that we can go to. So I think that was more a comment than a question.
Yeah.
So
no, thank you. And you know, it's for me, it's like I said, it's all about telling stories and bringing them, you know, into the classroom. And actually, you know, after I mentioned the Nature Chemistry article that was published, I actually got an email from a faculty member. I think he's teaching at one of the institutions in Connecticut. I forget which one, but he says he's been teaching for like 30 years. And so he read my op-ed, and he says he has been trying for decades to get his colleagues to tell stories in the classroom. And there's this resistance. You know, basically, they're like, the science is there. You don't need to tell any stories. What the hell are you talking about? There's a story behind every discovery. There's a story behind the scientist that made the discovery, you know. So, and it's not about, for me, changing the content. It's just slightly changing how you deliver the content. It's the same content, just do it a little bit differently. I mean, and I had about maybe 10, 11 years ago, when I was still teaching, I was teaching second semester general chemistry, and it focused on, we were on electrochemistry, which we all know is not an easy topic to teach. And so, but I love balance and redox reactions. You know, I've always done that. But it's not easy for students to grasp that either. And the textbook we were using at the time had an image of an iPod, which we all know are vintage electronic devices now, like turntables, but they were popular back then. And so I had this idea that, okay, I'm going to use the iPod to teach as a hook. So I went into class and I said, the title of this lecture is, What's in Your iPod? Tell me who's in your playlist. And the students were so engaged, and they started naming all of these artists that I had never heard of, New Direction, all of, you know. And so one young lady said she was old school. She loved the Beatles. She loved Michael Jackson. And so they were really into it. I said, okay, so we talked about who your favorite artists are. Tell me, how does this iPod work? So it's got a battery, right? So we started reviewing common oxidation states for the elements and stuff like that. And then I created a worksheet to balance redox reactions. And they really loved it. And because of that, their enthusiasm, I put together a short paper for JChemEd, and it was accepted back in 2010. So I kind of had an aha moment at that point that, you know, I didn't change the content. I just came in with an idea, and the students got, you know, kind of gravitated to it. So that's kind of been my approach. to teaching. It's not changing the content, just some sort of hook to get the kids to stick with it.
The back in ChemLinks days, back when NSF was putting a lot of money into chemistry development, so this was quite a while ago now, the group that I was working with we were developing these case studies, and they were kind of linked. They weren't just a one-day case study. They were sort of a 3-week case study. They were kind of lengthy. And this was a big community of folks working, not unlike Ionic, a big community of folks working on this project. And when we started, we said, well, it's all about the content. The content has to be real and practical and authentic and all this kind of stuff. And about a year into the project, we're like, oh, it's not about the content, it's about teaching and how you teach it, kind of thing. And so we rolled with that for about a year, and it's like, oh, you got to use the right teaching approaches and stuff. And after about a year of that, we finally were like, oh, it's about the story. And it took us 3 years to get there. But at the end, we're like that. And then when we realized that if we could just craft a really good story, that would be the important thing to do. And so, yeah, I love that. Oh,
I think it's funny that there's such...
The addendum to that was about 5 or 6 years after this was later, when this was all done, we realized we had one more part to add to the story. And it was really about the community and the people and what they did and what they learned. And that's why your outreach work is so great, Sabrina.
Thank you.
Because that's what it's about.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. There's like resistance to the storytelling part, right? And I've run into that too. Like, well, we don't need to talk about the people, we talk about the science. But I think everybody hears like the story of Isaac Newton and the apple, right? Like when you're learning about physics. And that's even disputed whether that's real or it's just a legend that's used to teach physics. Right. And these are like real stories that people are trying purposefully not to tell. And like you said, I think engagement, like if you can get people to like pay attention to what you're saying, that's half the battle, right? Like
that's the key.
It can't be completely devoid of personality.
Right. So. That's the key. How do you get them to pay attention? David, you had your hand up.
Well, and so related to that, like having the students, give them some scaffolding in it, but have the students discover the story themselves, right? If they're the ones that are doing the research and finding out, hey, this person group was the oldest of 10 kids, and like all those sort of details that they can then teach back to the class. I think that has the potential for really good impact. And so like having resources out there like this book is really useful.
Yeah, thank you. Now, and for like the learning object that I developed about Greg Robinson's research. So I didn't tell the students anything about Greg and all of that stuff ahead of time. What I did, we provided them with the chemical and engineering news articles that were published at that time, and a couple of Greg's papers, and also Cotton's papers, some of the rebuttal there. And we just gave it to them and said, okay, one group present the argument for one metal-metal bond, the other double, the other triple. And I was just so amazed that they were so engaged, and they started discovering what was going on, after reading this, so you're absolutely right, David, having the students, discover the story, and to see how they were just really wide-eyed and like, man, what was going on at the time? And then they turned and asked me, well, Dr. Collins, do you think it's really a triple bond? I said, I think it's somewhere between a double and a triple bond, somewhere there. That's what I think. But yeah, having the students discover the stories is just so fascinating, and to see them get excited about it. Because all we were talking about is, what is a chemical bond? That's all it really was. That was the central thing.
All right. Do we have anything else for Sabrina or that we want to bring up here? Make sure everyone has an opportunity if they've got something in mind.
Well, thanks so much, for this invitation. I really appreciate it.
Oh, Sabrina, thank you so much. That was wonderful. Thank you for the contribution of the Symposium Series book. I am sure it's going to be wildly popular. I have to ask the horrible question to finish things up. Is there another volume coming out in the future? Is it being planned?
Well, I was asked if I wanted to do a second volume. I said that let's just do one book right now. I actually am working on a second book And I kind of put it on hold to work on this one. So the tentative title of this new book is Superhero Science: The Next Time You Go to the Movies. So, so I'm drawing on, for example, how much I love these science fiction films. How, for example, Sigourney Weaver playing Lieutenant Ripley in Aliens, just how powerful that was for me. And I think the second Aliens was released in 1986. So I was, 16 years old. I'm in a packed movie theater in Detroit, and we are just cheering as she kicks the aliens' ass. Oh my God, and I never forgot that feeling. I absolutely just love science fiction films. So I'm that's the perspective I'm coming from as I put together this other book. So we'll see what happens.
Okay. Well, we look forward to that other book too, for sure. All right. Well, with that, I will draw to a close our 20th SLiTHER. Thank you again, Sabrina. Greatly appreciated. And thank you to everyone who attended.